She thought the Vampire King was finally asleep. She had no idea he would remember every word of her quiet prayer for the rest of eternity. Emily Carter tightened the faded gray cardigan around her shoulders as the grandfather clock in Blackstone Castle struck midnight. The sound echoed through endless marble corridors lined with towering bookshelves, stained glass windows, and portraits whose painted eyes always seemed to follow her every step. Most of the servants had already gone home hours ago, but Emily had volunteered for the late shift again. The extra $30 meant groceries for another week, and enough to keep the electricity on in her tiny apartment outside the city. She pushed her cleaning cart across the polished floor, careful not to let the wheels squeak in the silence. The Royal Library was the last room on her list. It was also the largest room she had ever seen, stretching farther than a football field beneath a ceiling painted with stars that shimmered in the candlelight. Thousands of ancient books rested behind glass cabinets, their leather bindings untouched by time. The room always felt colder than the rest of the castle, though no windows were open. Emily had learned not to ask questions. Everyone in Blackstone Castle followed one simple rule. Do your work. Keep your eyes down. Never disturb the king. She quietly dusted another shelf before noticing the soft glow near the fireplace. Someone was sitting there. Her heartbeat skipped. Vampire King Lucian Ashford rested in a tall black chair facing the dying fire. His head leaned slightly to one side, dark hair falling across his pale forehead. One elegant hand rested on the armrest while the other lay loosely across a closed leather book. The fire painted warm reflections across his impossibly white face, making him appear less like a ruler and more like a lonely statue forgotten by time. Emily froze. Every newspaper called him the most powerful man in the country. Every rumor described him as cold, unreadable, impossible to approach. Yet tonight he looked exhausted. She glanced toward the door. No guards, no advisors, no servants, just silence. Maybe he had finally fallen asleep. After another endless day of carrying responsibilities no ordinary person could understand. She knew she should leave immediately, but something held her there. Without making a sound, Emily removed her old cardigan. The fabric was worn at the elbows, and one sleeve had been stitched together twice by hand. It was the only warm sweater she owned. She stepped closer until she could gently place it across the king's shoulders. He never moved. She smiled sadly. Nobody should have to carry the whole world alone, she whispered, almost embarrassed by her own words. She lowered her eyes, folded her hands together, and spoke so softly she believed only the empty room could hear. God, whoever watches over people like him, please give him one peaceful night. Help him remember what it feels like to rest. If he's as lonely as he looks, please send him someone he can trust. Even kings deserve kindness. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she quickly brushed it away. And if you have any blessings left after that, maybe save one for people who are just trying their best. She gave one last glance toward the silent king, believing he had never heard a single word. Then she quietly picked up her cleaning cart and disappeared into the endless hallway. The heavy wooden door closed with barely a sound. The fire crackled softly. For several long seconds, nothing moved. Then the Vampire King's crimson eyes slowly opened in the darkness. He remained perfectly still beneath the worn cardigan, listening to the fading echoes of a prayer no one had spoken for him in more than 300 years. Morning sunlight spilled through the towering stained glass windows, filling the royal library with rivers of gold and crimson that stretched across the polished marble floor. Emily Carter returned with her cleaning cart just after 7 o'clock, expecting another ordinary shift, but the moment she stepped inside, she felt dozens of eyes following her. The librarian stopped whispering. The servants exchanged uncertain glances before quickly pretending to organize books. Even the royal guard standing beside the carved oak doors seemed unusually alert. Emily lowered her head, wondering if someone had discovered she had accidentally left her cardigan behind the night before. Her stomach tightened. She could not afford to lose this job. The supervisor, Mrs. Whitmore, approached with hurried steps, smoothing the front of her dark uniform. Emily, she said quietly, His Majesty has requested that only you clean the east wing today. Emily blinked. Only me. Mrs. Whitmore nodded, looking just as confused. The order came directly from the palace secretary before sunrise. Do exactly as you are told. Do not ask questions. Emily swallowed and quietly accepted the assignment. The East Wing had always been restricted, containing the oldest collection of royal records and private chambers reserved for the Vampire King himself. Ordinary servants rarely entered without supervision. She pushed her cart through the silent corridor, noticing fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases and sunlight reflecting off centuries-old armor displayed along the walls. Everything looked impossibly beautiful, yet strangely lonely. When she reached the private reading room, she found it completely empty. The fireplace had already been lit despite the warm spring morning. A silver tea service rested on a small table beside the familiar black chair where she had seen the king sitting the previous night. Her breath caught. Folded neatly across the back of that chair was her faded gray cardigan. Every wrinkle had been carefully smoothed. Every loose thread had somehow been repaired with invisible precision. Emily slowly walked toward it, hardly believing her eyes. Beside the sweater rested a handwritten note on thick ivory paper. She hesitated before picking it up. The elegant handwriting contained only 7 words. Kindness should never leave someone feeling cold. There was no signature, no royal seal, nothing that identified who had written it. Emily looked around the empty room, her heart beating faster. She gently touched the repaired sleeve where she remembered sewing uneven stitches only weeks earlier. They were gone. Whoever had repaired it had done so with extraordinary care, preserving every inch of worn fabric instead of replacing it. A faint smile appeared despite herself. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room, assuming perhaps another servant had shown compassion. She slipped the cardigan over her shoulders. It felt warmer than before, almost as though it had been resting beside the fire all morning. Unknown to Emily, behind an intricately carved wooden screen hidden beyond the bookshelves, Lucian Ashford watched in complete silence. His crimson eyes followed every expression that crossed her face. He had attended council meetings before sunrise, signed dozens of royal decrees, and listened to endless political arguments, yet none of those responsibilities had occupied his thoughts. Instead, he found himself remembering the quiet prayer spoken by a woman who believed no one had heard her. For more than 3 centuries, countless people had asked him for wealth, protection, influence, or miracles. Emily Carter had asked for none of those things. She had simply prayed that a lonely king might find peace. As she quietly resumed dusting the ancient shelves, humming a gentle hymn almost too softly for human ears to notice, Lucian made a decision that surprised even himself. The first test had ended. The second would begin before the sun set. Emily spent the rest of the morning believing the mysterious note was nothing more than an unexpected act of kindness from someone she would probably never meet. The thought stayed with her as she polished antique tables, organized centuries-old manuscripts, and carefully dusted shelves that reached nearly 50 feet toward the painted ceiling. Every now and then her fingers brushed against the sleeve of her repaired cardigan, reminding her that goodness sometimes appeared in the quietest ways. She smiled to herself and continued working. Across the castle, however, the atmosphere felt very different. Inside the council chamber, 12 ancient vampires gathered around a circular table carved from black stone that had stood for longer than any human kingdom could remember. Their conversation slowed as Lucian Ashford entered without announcing himself. Every council member immediately rose to their feet. The room fell silent. Lucian took his place at the head of the table, his expression calm, unreadable, yet his thoughts remained far from politics or trade agreements. Lord Cedric, the oldest council member, finally broke the silence. "Your Majesty, the palace records show that you have personally altered today's servant assignments." Lucian simply nodded. "I have." Several council members exchanged cautious glances. "May we ask the reason?" another elder said. Lucian looked toward the stained glass windows where sunlight scattered across the chamber floor. Curiosity. The single word confused everyone present. The Vampire King was not known for acting on curiosity. Every decision he made usually carried centuries of calculation. Lord Cedric folded his hands. "Is this regarding the human cleaner?" Lucian answered without hesitation. "Yes." The chamber became even quieter. "She has done nothing unusual," another council member observed carefully. "According to every report, she arrives early, works diligently, accepts no favors, and speaks to almost no one." Lucian rested one hand upon the ancient table. Exactly. None of them understood. 300 years had passed since their king had shown personal interest in any human servant. It was unprecedented. Meanwhile, completely unaware that her name had become the subject of royal discussion, Emily finished organizing a forgotten reading room tucked behind the Eastern archives. As she stacked several heavy books onto a wooden cart, she noticed a small leather journal lying beneath one of the tables. It appeared old, its cover cracked with age, its pages edged with gold leaf. There was no title, no family crest. Assuming someone had accidentally misplaced it, Emily gently picked it up. She opened only the first page, hoping to identify its owner. Instead, she found a handwritten sentence faded by time. The greatest strength of any kingdom is the kindness no law can command. Emily quietly smiled. That is beautiful, she whispered before carefully closing the journal. Without reading another page, she carried it toward the palace information desk so it could be returned properly. Hidden from view on the balcony above, Lucian had watched every second. The journal had not been forgotten. He had placed it there himself before sunrise. Inside its later pages rested maps of hidden royal vaults, forgotten bloodline records, and secrets that countless people would have traded fortunes to possess. Emily had not turned a single page beyond the first. She had not searched for treasure. She had not satisfied her curiosity. She had only wanted to return something that did not belong to her. Lucian slowly exhaled, something he had not needed to do for centuries. The second test had ended far sooner than expected. Yet instead of giving him answers, it only deepened the question that had quietly followed him since midnight. How could someone with so little still choose honesty when no one seemed to be watching? Emily placed the weathered journal on the information desk with a small handwritten note that simply read, "Found in the East Archives. I hope it reaches its owner." She smiled politely at the elderly librarian before returning to her duties, never realizing that several pairs of ancient eyes had quietly followed the entire exchange. Within minutes, the journal was carried through a series of private corridors until it rested once again upon Lucian Ashford's desk. The Vampire King looked at the untouched pages for a long moment. Even the faint layer of dust he had deliberately scattered across the hidden chapters remained perfectly undisturbed. He closed the cover with slow, thoughtful hands. Across the room, Lord Cedric waited silently before speaking. She did not read beyond the first page. Lucian answered without looking up. "I know. The test should be considered complete." Lucian slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the enormous windows overlooking Blackstone Castle's gardens. Below, gardeners trimmed white roses while servants carried baskets of fresh herbs toward the kitchens. Everything appeared peaceful, yet his thoughts remained fixed on one quiet human whose choices continued to defy every expectation. "No," he said at last. "The test has only begun." Cedric frowned slightly. "Your Majesty?" Lucian turned. Honesty when temptation is obvious proves character. Kindness when someone believes they are unseen reveals something deeper. The elder vampire remained respectfully silent, although concern briefly crossed his face. The king had not spoken this way in centuries. Meanwhile, Emily spent the afternoon helping prepare the castle for a formal diplomatic dinner scheduled that evening. Long tables were polished until they reflected the chandeliers overhead. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath hundreds of candles. Fresh flowers arrived by the cartload from the royal greenhouse. Every servant moved quickly but carefully, aware that representatives from several neighboring vampire houses would arrive before sunset. Emily quietly folded linen napkins while listening to the cheerful conversations around her. One young servant whispered that serving the royal guests often led to generous tips. Another joked that the visiting nobles rarely noticed the people carrying their meals. Emily laughed softly. Sometimes that is a blessing. She had always believed that ordinary people found their greatest peace by expecting nothing in return. As the afternoon faded into evening, Mrs. Whitmore approached carrying a polished silver tray. "Emily, one of the servers has become ill. I need you to help in the moonlight hall tonight." Emily's eyes widened. "I have never served during a royal banquet. Neither has anyone else available," Mrs. Whitmore replied with a tired smile. "Stay calm. Follow the others. Everything will be fine." Emily nodded despite the nervous flutter growing inside her chest. She changed into the formal black serving uniform, smoothed her repaired cardigan one final time before placing it inside her locker, and quietly followed the line of palace staff toward the grand hall. Unknown to every servant walking beside her, Lucian himself had arranged the sudden change only moments earlier. He stood on the upper balcony overlooking the magnificent ballroom as musicians tuned their instruments below. Hundreds of candles illuminated polished marble columns, while noble guests began arriving beneath banners embroidered with silver stars. Lucian watched Emily enter the hall carrying an empty serving tray with careful hands. She looked overwhelmed but determined to do her work well. A faint smile almost appeared on his face before disappearing just as quickly. Tonight there would be no hidden journal, no forgotten sweater, no private library. Surrounded by wealth, influence, admiration, and every opportunity to seek advantage, Emily Carter would unknowingly face the most difficult test of all. And once again, she would believe that no one was watching. Emily took a slow breath before stepping into Moonlight Hall, where every crystal chandelier shimmered like a sky filled with frozen stars. The enormous room glowed with golden candlelight, reflecting from polished marble floors so perfectly that the guests seemed to walk upon light itself. Noble vampires arrived one after another, dressed in elegant black and silver, their graceful movements almost silent despite the hundreds gathered inside the hall. Soft classical music floated through the room, while servers carried polished silver trays between tables with practiced precision. Emily tightened her grip on her tray and reminded herself of the only goal that mattered. Do your job well. Do not spill anything. Do not draw attention. Mrs. Whitmore quietly assigned her to the western section, where visiting dignitaries from distant vampire houses were seated. Emily nodded politely and began serving sparkling mineral water, fresh bread, and steaming dishes prepared by the royal kitchens. She smiled warmly at every guest regardless of whether they acknowledged her. Most barely looked in her direction. She did not mind. Invisible people often notice things everyone else overlooked. From the elevated royal balcony, Lucian Ashford observed the ballroom without speaking. Several council members stood nearby, pretending to discuss diplomatic matters, although each secretly watched the same young servant carrying a silver tray through the crowd. Lord Cedric finally spoke. If she seeks favor, tonight will reveal it. Lucian answered quietly. Perhaps. Or perhaps tonight will reveal something else. Down below, Emily noticed an elderly vampire noble sitting alone near one of the tall windows. While laughter echoed across the ballroom, his untouched dinner slowly grew cold. Every server passed by his table because he had requested nothing. Emily hesitated for only a moment before quietly approaching him. Good evening, sir, she said gently. May I warm your soup? It may taste better while it is still hot. The elderly gentleman looked up with mild surprise. You noticed? Emily smiled. My grandmother always said warm food is one way to remind people they matter. Without waiting for praise, she carefully replaced the bowl with a fresh serving from the nearby station before returning to her duties. She never learned that the elderly guest was Lord Alden, one of the oldest allies of the Vampire King and a man respected across every royal territory. Lord Alden watched Emily disappear into the crowd before quietly smiling to himself. A few minutes later, another unexpected moment unfolded. A young servant rushing through the ballroom stumbled after catching her foot on the edge of a decorative carpet. The stack of folded linen she carried scattered across the marble floor. Several nearby nobles frowned with visible annoyance. The frightened servant immediately knelt, her hands trembling as she tried to gather everything before anyone complained. Emily set down her own tray without hesitation and knelt beside her. It is all right, she whispered with a reassuring smile. Everyone has difficult days. Together they folded each linen cloth with careful hands. The embarrassed servant blinked back grateful tears. Thank you. I thought I was going to lose my job. Emily simply smiled. Then let us make sure you do not. From across the ballroom, Lucian had witnessed every second. No reward had been offered. No audience had applauded. Emily had acted exactly as she had in the silent library, believing no important eyes were watching. Yet before she could return to serving the guests, a palace attendant approached and bowed respectfully. Miss Carter, he said, loud enough for several nearby nobles to hear. His Majesty requests your presence in the royal gallery immediately. Conversations throughout the ballroom softened into curious whispers as dozens of elegant faces slowly turned toward the humble young server who suddenly found herself standing at the center of everyone's attention. Emily stood motionless for a heartbeat, her empty silver tray suddenly feeling heavier than it had only seconds before. Around her, conversations faded into quiet curiosity as elegantly dressed nobles watched the young server who had somehow earned a personal summons from the Vampire King. Mrs. Whitmore gave her an encouraging nod from across the ballroom, though the older woman's expression revealed the same confusion everyone else felt. Emily carefully handed her tray to another server, smoothed the front of her uniform, and followed the palace attendant through a pair of towering silver doors leading into the royal gallery. The music from the banquet gradually disappeared behind her until only the soft echo of her footsteps remained. Paintings of former kings lined the long corridor, their solemn faces illuminated by candlelight. Emily lowered her eyes as she walked, trying to steady her breathing. She quietly wondered whether she had unknowingly broken some royal rule. When they reached the end of the gallery, the attendant opened a carved wooden door before bowing respectfully. "His Majesty will see you now." Emily stepped inside alone. The room was surprisingly simple compared to the grandeur of the ballroom. Tall windows overlooked moonlit gardens where white roses shimmered beneath the evening sky. Shelves filled with ancient books surrounded a stone fireplace whose gentle flames filled the chamber with warmth. Standing near one of the windows was Lucian Ashford. His hands rested behind his back as he gazed toward the gardens. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Emily respectfully lowered her head. "Your Majesty." Lucian slowly turned to face her. His calm crimson eyes studied her with quiet attention, not with the distant authority she had expected. "Miss Carter." His voice remained steady and gentle. "Thank you for coming." Emily blinked. She had expected questions, perhaps even a formal warning, but certainly not gratitude. "Of course, Your Majesty." Lucian walked toward a small table where 2 porcelain teacups had already been prepared. "Would you care for tea?" Emily looked genuinely surprised. "If it is permitted." A faint warmth entered Lucian's expression. "Tonight it is." He poured tea into both cups before offering one to her with measured courtesy. Emily accepted it carefully with both hands. The fragrant steam carried hints of honey and chamomile. It reminded her of evenings spent with her grandmother long before she had come to Blackstone Castle. Lucian noticed the small smile that briefly softened her face. "It brings back a memory." Emily nodded. "My grandmother believed tea could not solve every problem, but it could make difficult conversations easier." Lucian allowed a quiet silence to settle between them. "She sounds wise." Emily smiled again. She usually was. The king looked into the dancing firelight before asking the question that had lingered in his thoughts since midnight. "Tell me, Miss Carter, why did you place your sweater over someone you believed would never know?" Emily seemed almost embarrassed by the question. She lowered her cup and answered honestly. "Because being kind only when someone is watching is not really kindness." Lucian remained perfectly still. Every word echoed through the room with greater force than any speech he had heard from kings or generals. Emily continued softly, never realizing how deeply her answer reached him. "People become tired in different ways. Some work too hard. Some carry too much responsibility. Some simply feel alone. If I can make one difficult evening a little easier for someone, even for a stranger, then perhaps the world becomes a little warmer." Lucian held her gaze for the first time without hiding his emotions completely. Before he could reply, a sharp knock interrupted the quiet room. The door opened, and Lord Cedric stepped inside with an expression more serious than before. He bowed respectfully, but spoke without delay. "Your Majesty, the council has learned that the human servant is here. They request her immediate presence before the full assembly. They insist there are questions that cannot wait." Emily's fingers tightened gently around the warm teacup before she carefully placed it back onto the small wooden table. The peaceful conversation that had eased her nervousness only moments earlier disappeared beneath the weight of Lord Cedric's announcement. She looked from the elder vampire to Lucian Ashford, uncertain whether she should remain or quietly excuse herself. The silence stretched for several long seconds. Finally, Lucian spoke, his voice calm enough to steady the room itself. "Then the council may ask its questions." Cedric inclined his head respectfully. "They are already assembled. Lucian gave a slight nod before turning toward Emily. There is no reason to be afraid. Emily managed a small smile, although her heartbeat had begun to race. I have never spoken before a royal council. Neither had anyone the first time, Lucian replied with quiet reassurance. Simply answer honestly. Those simple words settled something inside her. Honesty had never been difficult. She had very little else to offer. Together they walked through the stone corridors leading toward the council chamber. The palace attendants stepped aside as the king approached, their polished shoes making almost no sound upon the marble floor. Emily followed several feet behind him, trying not to stare at the magnificent architecture surrounding her. Massive pillars reached toward vaulted ceilings painted with silver constellations, while ancient banners bearing the royal crest hung motionless in the still air. Everything felt impossibly old, as though the castle itself remembered centuries she could barely imagine. At the enormous bronze doors, 2 royal guards bowed before slowly pulling them open. Inside, 12 members of the royal council sat around the great circular table exactly as they had earlier that day. Their expressions remained composed, yet Emily could immediately sense that each pair of eyes was studying her with careful attention. She stopped just inside the entrance and respectfully lowered her head. Good evening. Lord Cedric motioned gently toward the open space in the center of the chamber. Miss Carter, thank you for joining us. Emily stepped forward quietly. The room felt surprisingly peaceful despite its solemn atmosphere. No one raised their voice. No one appeared angry. Still, she understood that every answer she gave mattered. Another council member, Lady Evelyn, folded her hands upon the polished stone table. We have reviewed reports regarding your recent conduct inside Blackstone Castle. Emily's face immediately filled with concern. I hope I have not caused any problems. Several council members exchanged brief glances before Lady Evelyn continued. You returned valuable property without examining it. You assisted another servant, although no one instructed you to do so. You offered kindness to Lord Alden without recognizing his position. Can you explain why? Emily looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Because those things seemed like the right choices. Even if no reward followed, another elder asked. Emily answered almost immediately. Especially then. The chamber became noticeably quieter. Lucian watched every face around the table without speaking. Emily continued softly, choosing her words with care. My grandmother always believed that character is measured by the decisions people make when they believe no one important is watching. I suppose I never stopped believing her. Lord Cedric leaned back thoughtfully. And if helping others cost you something? Emily smiled with quiet humility. Sometimes kindness costs time. Sometimes comfort. Sometimes money. But if everyone waits until kindness is convenient, many people will never receive it. A gentle silence settled across the chamber. Even the flickering candles seemed to stand still. Several council members who had entered expecting to uncover hidden motives instead found themselves listening to simple truths spoken without pride or performance. Then, as Emily unconsciously folded her hands together while speaking, Lady Evelyn's eyes suddenly widened. She stared at the young woman's fingers with unmistakable surprise. Upon Emily's right wrist, just beneath the sleeve of her uniform, a faint silver pattern shimmered for the briefest instant before fading like moonlight reflected across still water. Lucian saw it as well. So did every ancient vampire seated around the table. No one spoke. But in that single silent moment, the questions surrounding Emily Carter changed forever. No one in the chamber moved. The faint silver light had already disappeared beneath the sleeve of Emily Carter's uniform. Yet its brief appearance lingered in the minds of every ancient vampire present. Emily noticed the unusual silence and glanced around the circular chamber with quiet uncertainty. Did I say something wrong? She asked softly. Lady Evelyn slowly rose from her chair, her eyes never leaving Emily's right wrist. Miss Carter, she said with remarkable calm, would you kindly roll back your sleeve? Emily looked confused but politely obeyed. She carefully folded the fabric above her wrist. The skin beneath appeared perfectly ordinary. There was no glowing mark, no silver pattern, nothing unusual at all. Emily looked down herself before offering an apologetic smile. I am sorry. I do not understand. Lady Evelyn exchanged a thoughtful glance with Lord Cedric. Neither do we. The elder council members remained silent for several moments, each remembering stories passed down through generations. legends rarely spoken aloud, ancient signs that had not appeared for centuries. Lucian quietly observed Emily's expression. There was no fear in her eyes, only genuine confusion. Whatever had happened had surprised her as much as everyone else. He finally stepped forward. "Miss Carter, have you ever seen a silver mark appear on your wrist before tonight?" Emily gently shook her head. "Never, Your Majesty." "Has anyone in your family ever mentioned unusual symbols, old traditions, or forgotten stories?" She thought carefully before answering. "My grandmother used to tell me that every act of kindness leaves a mark somewhere, even if we cannot see it." A faint smile crossed her face as she remembered. "She always said heaven remembers what people forget." Several council members lowered their eyes, almost disappointed by the ordinary answer. Yet Lucian continued watching her. "Anything else?" Emily hesitated. "There was one thing." The room immediately grew still again. "When I was very little," she continued, "my grandmother sometimes sang an old lullaby whenever thunderstorms frightened me. She said her own grandmother had taught it to her many years earlier. I never knew where it came from." Lord Cedric leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember it?" Emily smiled with quiet embarrassment. "Only part of it. I have not thought about it in years." Lucian gave a gentle nod. "Please." Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, searching through distant memories. Then, almost in a whisper, she softly sang a few simple lines. The melody floated gently through the chamber, quiet and peaceful like rain falling upon still water. It carried no grand performance, only warmth, comfort, and the innocence of childhood. Emily opened her eyes, slightly embarrassed. "I am sorry. That is all I remember." No one answered. The council members remained completely motionless. Lord Cedric's expression had changed entirely. Lady Evelyn slowly covered her mouth with one hand. Even the candles seemed strangely still. Lucian stood frozen where he was. He knew that melody. He had heard it once before, long before Blackstone Castle had been built, long before modern cities had risen beyond the surrounding hills. It had been sung inside the ancient royal sanctuary by the first queen of his kingdom as a blessing over children during times of peace. That song had disappeared from history more than 600 years ago. No written copy had survived. No official record remained. Yet Emily Carter, an ordinary young woman who believed herself to be nobody special, had just remembered part of it without ever knowing its name. She looked around at the silent faces with growing concern. Was it inappropriate? Lucian slowly walked toward her until only a few feet separated them. His voice remained gentle, but for the first time since they had met, genuine wonder could be heard beneath every word. "No, Miss Carter." His crimson eyes never left hers. "It was forgotten. Until tonight." The silence that followed Lucian's words felt almost sacred. Emily looked from one face to another, still unable to understand why a simple lullaby remembered from childhood had transformed the atmosphere inside the council chamber. She gently lowered her sleeve over her wrist again, as though covering the mystery would somehow make everyone more comfortable. "I wish I could explain," she said. Quietly. "It was only a song my grandmother sang whenever storms frightened me." Lord Cedric slowly rose from his chair. The wisdom of centuries rested behind his thoughtful eyes, yet even he seemed humbled by what he had witnessed. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully, "there are moments when history chooses ordinary people to carry extraordinary memories. They often do not realize what they possess until the right moment arrives." Emily offered a polite smile, unsure how to respond. "I have never considered myself extraordinary." Before anyone else could speak, Lucian stepped into the center of the chamber beside her. His calm voice echoed gently through the circular hall. "That is precisely why you have earned my trust." Several council members exchanged surprised glances. The Vampire King rarely made personal declarations before the full assembly. Lucian continued without hesitation. "For days, this council has wondered why I altered servant assignments, requested private meetings, and observed one human more closely than anyone could understand." He looked toward the 12 elders gathered around the table. "Tonight, I will answer that question." Every eye remained fixed upon him. "I first noticed Emily Carter because she believed I was asleep." Emily's eyes widened slightly. Lucian met her gaze with quiet honesty. "I heard every word of the prayer you whispered beside the library fireplace." Emily stood completely still. Her cheeks warmed with embarrassment as she remembered placing her old cardigan over his shoulders. "Your Majesty, I never intended to intrude." "You did not." His voice carried unexpected warmth. "You expected nothing. You asked for nothing. You simply wished peace upon someone you believed would never know your name." The chamber remained perfectly silent. Lucian slowly turned toward the council once more. "Since that night, I have watched every decision she has made. She returned what did not belong to her. She served strangers with equal kindness regardless of status. She comforted those who believed themselves invisible. She chose honesty when secrecy would have been easier. None of these actions were performed for recognition." "Lord." Alden smiled gently from his place at the table. Several other council members quietly lowered their eyes in thoughtful agreement. Lucian continued, "Power reveals itself easily. Character does not. Character is discovered in moments when applause is absent." Emily felt tears gathering despite every effort to remain composed. No one had ever spoken about her life that way before. She had always believed her small choices disappeared unnoticed into ordinary days. Lucian looked back toward her. "Miss Carter, I cannot yet explain the silver mark or the forgotten song. Those answers belong to a history we must uncover together. But one truth is already beyond question." He paused, allowing every person in the chamber to hear his next words clearly. "Kindness has changed this kingdom before. Perhaps it has returned to do so again." Beyond the towering windows, the first rays of dawn quietly appeared above the distant mountains, painting the eastern sky with soft shades of gold. Emily followed the growing light with silent wonder, unaware that her life had crossed an invisible threshold from which there could be no return. Somewhere beneath the sleeve covering her right wrist, the hidden silver mark shimmered once more, unseen by everyone in the room. Far below the castle, inside a forgotten sanctuary sealed for 600 years, an ancient crystal resting upon a stone altar answered with a faint silver glow of its own, as though something that had slept through countless generations had finally awakened, waiting patiently for the girl who had changed a king's heart simply by believing he deserved a peaceful night.